and both Harriet and I are volunteers. Kulanu deals with returning, emerging, and isolated communities. And the reason why I'm saying this is somebody asked a question halfway through a presentation, and what group is this? So I'm telling you all, we deal with emerging Jewish communities around the globe. At this point, I want to introduce Shulamit Halevi. She is an internationally renowned scholar on crypto-Jews, B'nai Anusim, and formerly known as Marranos. She is widely called the mother of Anusim, and she dedicates herself to help Anusim find their origins if they wish and return to Judaism. She holds a doctorate from Hebrew University in the history of the Jewish people, which she did under the late Professor Yom Tov Assis and under Professor Shalom Sabar. The subject was the surviving identity and heritage of descendants of the Iberian Jews living in Mexico, and is considered the foremost expert in the general field of contemporary crypto-Jewish heritage. She is a one-woman non-organization that is private and does not even charge expenses for the people she helps. She advises several chief rabbis and people who have conversion issues who are descendants of B'nai Anusim come to her, and she helps negotiate the terrain for them. Her third book of poetry will be published by the Kibbutz Me'uchad Poalim Publishing House. There is an article in our Kulanu newsletter, 1996, from her. She writes poetry, and I think the name of her poem that we have published is Under One Canopy.
No, that's the book that it's in.
Her poem is in our collection called Under One Canopy, and her poem was called Your Reflection in My Mirror. I want to really humbly and proudly introduce Shulamit Halevi to introduce our keynote speaker. Shulamit?
Again.
Bonnie, she's muted.
Me?
Molly, can you unmute her?
No. Oops.
There we go.
I'm unmuted. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I could list. I was given a list of. It disappeared from my iPad here. Of about 24 medals and honors that Jenny got. And I could run through them and it'll really be impressive, but it will not describe Jenny. Jenny is an incredible woman. She is full of energy. She's full of warmth. Her heart is bigger than her body. I don't know where she puts it. And she cannot be stopped. I promise you, nobody stops Jenny. And Jenny has a purpose. And when Jenny has a purpose, she approaches it. And when she's turned back, she comes back, she comes back, she comes back. And in the end, she accomplishes it. And her purpose is never personal. No, she's done her personal journey. And now her purpose is to take back from the Spaniards and the Portuguese and every place else, take back all these documents that belong to us, the Toledo Tombo, the various archives, to get them back. And she's going and taking and doing and working She's unstoppable. And so she can write a recipe book, and she can do other motherly things. And
Okay, thank
but,
you. It's a
but
very great
what
introduction
Jenny
to Genie.
is, I think, would approach what Donna Grazia Mendez Nassi did in her time. I would go this far.
Wow.
Jenny, you are my amazing friends. You go after the documents, and the Anusim go through me, and together we are undoing history. Yishar kochech. May God give you strength, on and on.
Thank you very much, Shulamit. That was a very beautiful introduction. Jeannie?
Here I am, Shulamit and Bonnie, Harriet, thank you so much. Shulamit, I don't know how to follow with all of that. I'm not good at hearing that. I thank you very much. I'm going to cover here about 523 years of history in the next 30 minutes. So hang on tight because I got a lot to say. I'm going to give you my own personal background briefly so we can move forward. I was born in Cuba, Roman Catholic family from Spain, raised Roman Catholic and Catholic grade schools, high schools, university, all women. I mean, there's enough jokes about the nuns in 1960 so that you know what I went through in the 60s. But I always felt I did not belong to the people I had been born to. I felt, I didn't know at the time that it was Jewish, I felt, because I was too young. I started feeling uneasy in my own body at the age of 6. And I came around, and finally in my late 20s, I did a formal conversion to Judaism. And I converted traditionally, so it took me 5.5 years in a very long, drawn out PhD of Judaism that I had to go through in Miami, which is what a 5.5 year period of study will go through. But all along through my childhood, my grandmothers and my mother to a lesser degree had been teaching me customs that were Spanish and Spanish customs, and everything was a family custom, and everything was, the word Jewish was not mentioned. And my grandmother, when I started my conversion, my maternal grandmother, she was in her 80s. So she was very with it at the time. And she really never said to me anything about being Jewish. I never even suspected, as crazy as that is, and this is why I mentioned that I had a PhD in Jewish, but I didn't put 2 and 2 together as I was growing up, and my grandmother was teaching me basically through cooking, and I'll get to that in a minute, and she was teaching me all this. It didn't occur to me that at some level we could have been from the Jews of Spain and Portugal, even though my grandmother and grandfather were first cousins. And I knew from a family tree I had seen that their parents were first cousins and their grandparents were first cousins. So it just kind of seemed normal to me. I thought everybody married their cousins. I never understood. So it wasn't easy on my family, and you know, that's for a different talk. But during this process, I lost everyone I had ever loved or known. My family was not happy. My mom was not happy at all. My friends from Catholic school, everybody kind of went poof and everybody disappeared. And the Jewish people, to people that are converting traditional, it's not so, you know, not so easy for somebody to extend a hand in a synagogue and say, hey, come for dinner. So for a good 8-9 year period, I was alone with small children. My son was 15, my daughter was 3 or 4. And it was a very difficult time in my life. I was a single mom, working in the family business, having all of this struggle, my existential struggle, because I've always been a woman of faith. and having everybody turn against me. So throughout that whole period, I kept asking my mom if she had any documents, and she denied having anything. It was really, it was a very tough period. So finally, on one day, my grandmother, when she died, she left me some jewelry that I'll show you in the slideshow later, and a family tree that showed me these endogamous relationships going back to 1725. By then, I had already been a practicing, you know, Ashkenaz, let's put it that way. I was a practicing in an Ashkenaz in a young Israel, president of sisterhood, treasurer of the synagogue. So very active in the Jewish community, but never suspecting that there was anything beyond. So finally, I was able to gather all of the documents going back until 22 generations of women, going back to about 40 women burned at the stake or tried in the Inquisitions of Portugal and Sevilla in Spain for being Jews. And with all of that paperwork, I became very vocal on the social media, and I started writing my books, my 15 grandmothers, how I found my 15 grandmothers. Initially it was 15, and later I went back 22 grandmothers to 1405. So the reality is that I started to see that this movement was much bigger than me. It was much bigger than anybody in Latin America. It was bigger, and it seemed that there was very few people. I hooked up with Shulamit, for example. I randomly found Shulamit. I would randomly find another scholar in a different place. And there were like pinpoint people around the world. And if you think about it, even today, there's just pinpoint people around the world that can say we're experts or we're scholars or we help the B'nai Anusim or organizations like Kulanu. So I took all of that paperwork back to Israel because by Jewish law, I was a Jew, but I had not converted my kids for a myriad of reasons. And initially I wanted to be said that I was Jewish from birth, and the rabbis had me find the Jewish history of the village of my ancestors, which by the way is behind me. And there was nothing written in anything. There was no historian that had ever written about it. So the rabbis didn't just want me in Israel to find that I was from a maternal lineage unbroken. They wanted me to totally document the Jewish history of this little village behind me where nobody knew anything. So after a very long time, I finally was able to receive a letter from the highest Jewish court in Israel, the Beit Din Gadol, saying that I had been born Jewish and all my ancestors were Jewish and anyone that descended from me was Jewish. But the rabbi, when he gave me that letter several years ago, he gave it to me with a caveat, and he said, I'm buying you 2 generations. If you don't solve this mess in your family in 2 generations, this is it. All that beautiful work you've done, they're gonna throw it away, they're gonna cart it out, they're gonna put it in a dumpster, and you're done. So what I'm giving you here is I'm giving you the gift of 2 generations of time. And I thought, oh, no pressure, right? Because none of my kids wanted this gift. I mean, I'm probably the proudest Jew you know. My children were not interested in it. No one was interested, and that is when I began to work on behalf of the B'nai Anusim. So still a lot of, very difficult with mom, but in 2013, when we moved mom out of the house and she had Alzheimer's, by the way, she's still alive, she's 92. So I found this treasure trove of these recipes, and you'll see pictures later. And as I sat on the floor in my mom's house, not only did I find all of these recipes, I also found the originals of all of these papers that mom said that she never had, that I paid dearly in trips going back to Spain and Portugal to find the birth certificates, the death certificates. And I'm like, to go Ashkenaz, like, oy vavoy. I mean, really, it was, what's going on here? So mom knew, my grandmother knew. So through these recipes, my grandmother taught me we were 5 granddaughters, and she only took me. She only saw the interest for the food and the teaching in me. She taught me how to check for blood in the eggs. She taught me how to check for, you know, insects in the vegetables. And what happened is that I found myself with a few hundred snippets of paper, some recipes again and again and again written through the generations. And I had to translate them all into English, try to translate them into modern measurements. And then I had to send them out to 150 colleagues and friends around the world, begging them to make it, which they did. And Shulamit at the end was like, oh, I'll give it to my daughter. So actually Shulamit's daughter did make one of the recipes for me in the book. And in Israel, Geffen Publishing agreed the recipes of my 15 grandmothers. Now, I had written 5 books before this that really had the core, the nucleus of the history of the family, but nobody cared. They just, you know, when it's about Jews and food, it just goes crazy. So I noticed, and what I found the most interesting is that my family in different times, they went from Spain to Portugal to Canary Islands to Cartagena, Colombia, and finally to Costa Rica and Cuba. And every time that the grandmothers would move from place to place, the ingredients, the recipes were the same, but the ingredients would change. So initially they were all about olive oil and almonds and let's say anise. Anise liquor was kind of like an Iraq, but like the big thing. Everything, oh my gosh, everything is anise. So when they moved to Costa Rica, all of a sudden the liquor was fig, and I knew they were in Costa Rica. Or when they were in Cuba, all of a sudden the recipe, it was rum. So I was really able to date the recipes by the recipes of the family. And many of the recipes, and you'll see a small video, we have recipes that I do believe go back to the Inquisition times, because we have one called pork chops. And the pork chops, they look like pork chops, and you'll see them soon, but they're really made out of French toast. And there's enough historically written in the Inquisition records saying that the crypto Jews were faking to eat pork chops and throwing a pork chop in the fire, and then so that no one would know that they were not eating pork. So some of this crypto Jewish customs, they did pass down to people, not only to me, they passed down to many people that I deal with. And I know that Shulamit has hundreds of these, if not thousands of these cases documented, where people come to me and they have a custom to light the candles in a closet on Friday night, or they have this custom that's a family custom. They make a little altar, and in the altar are the Friday night candles, or the truth is hidden in the jewelry. And in my case, I go up and down these little villages in Spain and Portugal to find the truth in architectural etchings. Because when it struck me, and I found in my own village of my ancestors, I found one mikvah underground, and I found a mikvah in the middle of the city, and I found all of these markings on the walls, and I realized that our moment in history, it's gone, yet there are millions of descendants. And this has been, the demographers in Israel go between, there's 50 million like me, or there's 200 million like me. But this doesn't mean that everybody wants to return to the Jewish people like I did. But what I find so important is that when they start acknowledging that their ancestry was Jewish, or they start acknowledging that that it's very difficult to come back. I mean, let's face it, my whole family's Catholic. The Christmas tree is beautiful. There's tons of these gifts under the tree. It's in my family, my sister, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin. So, you know, and when you don't have, like, let's say, a super strong conviction, it's very hard. So what they've done all over the world and in Latin America, especially, is that the Anusim, or the crypto-Jewish descendants, they feel this fire burning, and they start coming together in their own communities. And it is these communities that Kulanu has identified. It's these communities that we work with. I personally take care in Kulanu. I overlook and I take care of the communities that are in Latin America. And they have a representative like me overlooking many other communities in Africa and many other places. So these conversos didn't come always directly from Spain and Portugal like mine did. In 1596, they had a major influx into Mexico. Then there was a Mexican Inquisition. They had a major influx into Brazil. And then in the Lima, Peru Inquisition was catching the Brazilian ones. So at some point, I realized that I had been able to find, after a lot of money and a lot of work, and the people that I was telling them how to come forth and get this done didn't have the means, and there was nothing on the internet. You literally have to go to Spain, and you literally have to go to Portugal and look at boxes that in many times have no dates in them. They're just, you know, Toledo box, 20 boxes, you know, Coimbra in Portugal, 30 boxes, and they were not digitized. So yes, there's some digitized, but if the rabbis are requiring, and not everybody wants to go through what I did. Some feel the Jewish spark and they just want to convert and that's it and they're done. Other people say, no, if my family was always Jewish, why do I have to convert? So that's when I started working with the records. I got funding in Israel, and I set off in 2015 with all of my ambition and all of like, I'm gonna get it done. And from 2015 until today, I have visited every archive, sat with every director, brought people with me from Israel, brought people with me from the EU, and I have been hitting brick walls ever since. And I have been dealing at the highest levels with the ministers of culture. And I didn't realize until last year that behind the whole stopping of this was the Catholic Church, not wanting to bring out this history. On the other hand, like Shulamit says, these are our records, this is our history. Everybody knows the Inquisition happened. Let's get over it, let's move on and give me back, because every Inquisition record has in it all of the genealogy of every person who was judged. So imagine, you've got 15 pages of genealogy written, sitting in a box somewhere, and you've got somebody in Central America wanting this, not having the money to be able to get this up online. So this is what I have been doing since then. I do want to show you a slideshow that Molly will show you now. And I want to talk a little bit about the slides so you can see it a little bit more live. Molly, you ready? Okay, well, I'm holding a cake called Bollo Maimon. And this is a very interesting cake because it's called Maimonides cake. So in a Cuban Catholic family, to have a cake called Maimonides cake is just a little different. So this is a cake that I gave it to a Sephardic friend of mine to make, and she said that was always also in her family. It's in the recipe book, and so this is the Maimonides cake. Next. So these are my grandmothers. I'm really proud of my grandmothers. To the left is my grandmother that taught me everything I know, and all the way to the bottom are her great-grandparents. So all of my grandmothers, and I don't have pictures of all 22 of them, but this is what I have, and I hold them dearly. Every Friday night when I light my candles, I feel all these little Spanish women around me dressed in black that are just cheering me on, because I brought them back to the Jewish people. Next.
Good morning. My name is Genie Milgrom, and I am a direct descendant of the Spanish-Portuguese Jews that were escaping the Inquisition in the 15th century. Today I have a very special recipe for you that is one of many that stayed in my family for 523 years. In the 15th century, they were forced to convert to Catholicism and had to practice their religion in secret. So recipes like this one, which is a twist on French toast, you can see they look like pork chops. but really it's a breaded fried French toast recipe with tomato jam and candied red peppers. So at the same time that they would be making this recipe, they would sit down at the table and eat it as if it were a pork chop, but the reality is that the pork chop smell was being made by burning in the fire a real pork chop. And they would fool everyone by eating things like this and not succumbing to the wave of Catholicism that was going across the country. I feel so proud to descend from a group of women who were so clever in hiding and keeping their kashrut underground for what is centuries. A lot of the things that I do when I make these recipes are traditions passed down from my own grandmother and her grandmother. And in my quest, I have found 22 grandmothers in an unbroken maternal lineage leading straight back to the Inquisition. Somehow, in a crazy way, those recipes survived in snippets of little papers that I have going back all of these centuries to these kinds of traditions that they held underground. I'm proud to descend from such a strong group of Jewish women who so cleverly continue to keep their kashrut by making dishes such as this. Thank you.
So you can see here, this is actually the recipe is on the left, and you can see it's a little piece of bread that they would burn, and the little piece of bread was put in as a pork chop. And I have to confess to you that as I was going through all of these cookbooks and these papers, this one literally, chuleta in Spanish means pork chop. And every time I would go through the chuleta recipe, I'd pass it because I didn't want to find that the grandmothers had eaten pork, because up to then, as I was going through these recipes, they had never eaten a non-kosher meat. They had never mixed meat and milk. So it was, every time I would open it to this page, as I was transcribing, I was like, oh no. And then finally, I finished with the book and I said, this is ridiculous. I'm going to take a look at this one, and maybe I substituted for a lamb chop. And it was the last one I looked at. And lo and behold, it was French toast. Molly? So a couple of months ago, right before the COVID started in February, many of you may know Jamie Geller, the Joy of Kosher. She's got her own show in Beit Shemesh in Israel. And she was fascinated by the whole pork chop thing. So she she made a show. We did a show in her home together. This is it. And we made pork chops, and she named the show Pork Chop. So it really was, for me, an important way to get the word out. Next. So it was a challenge when I got to her kitchen, because I had asked her for a loaf of bread. So here, you know, we were in Israel, and she brings me this thing. And I wasn't sure it was going to work, and we were on live, and there was about 12,000 people watching. And then she said to me, which is right, listen, your grandmother's made it like this, I'm sure. So it worked out beautifully, and she's just a joy of herself to watch. Next. These periquillos were made during Hanukkah time. They are literally just flour and sugar and oil, a lot of oil. And when you fry them, they open up and they look like a parrot, which is perico in Spanish. This is another one also for Hanukkah, just fried balls of dough. And my grandmother taught me all of my Jewish customs via all of these recipes. Next. This is a very interesting one. So the Inquisition knew when Yom Kippur was. So you couldn't really go out and fast during Yom Kippur. You had to just go about your daily time, but they wanted to fast. They wanted to fast so bad, and they wanted to keep the traditions. And they invented, for the holiday of Purim, that for us it's a carnival-like holiday, and not a religious holiday, but the main character is Esther in the book. in the book of Purim, they invented Saint Esther. And to this day, people think that Saint Esther is a Catholic saint in Portugal, when the reality is that Esther is a made-up Jewish saint. So they would make this empanada that I made at home, and the recipe, you can see it's old, it's falling apart, and they would make it, and they specified that they were using ham-like meats to look like ham. Then they would roll this up, they put a cover on it, it's like an artisan empanada that was huge. They would put it in picnic baskets, and then they would go out to the river on this day of fast of Saint Esther. They would fast the whole day, and keeping in mind that this was as if it were Yom Kippur, they would fast and they would eat this after the fast, and this is documented in other villages. Next. So these rosquillas are very interesting. I have a very good friend. She's a colleague, and she's an ethnomusicologist, Dr. Judith Cohen, and she happened to be in Ibiza when I emailed her and said, you must make me a recipe. So I emailed her the recipe, and she's at the home of a descendant of crypto Jews from Ibiza. And when she pulls out the recipe, her friend pulls out her recipe, and it was in her family as a crypto Jewish recipe from time immemorial as well. So these rosquillas are also made with dough. Everything's like doughy, anisey, you know, orangey, and fried. Next. These are a lot of the recipes. They were written again and again. Some were more modern. You can see there's pen. Some were splattered. Initially, I must tell you that initially I was upset with Mom as I sat on that floor. She was no longer in the house, and you know, it took me so many years to get to the information. And initially, I had like a wave of upset, and then I thought, you know what? No. One of my favorite things about that I've learned in Judaism from Pirkei Avot is to judge others favorably, and it just kind of kicked in that moment. My mom and all of those grandmothers schlepped this from country to country to country when they had to leave Spain because of Franco, when they had to leave Cuba because of Castro. Every time they would bring a few things and all of these recipes and papers. So the reality is that I thank my mom from the bottom of my heart for having taken this every time they moved, as well as the grandmothers. Next. So jewelry is one of the, moving along from the, what do we have left? We don't have ketubot, we don't have cemeteries, we don't have circumcision papers, we have nothing. But we have these traditions, and sometimes they're tangible. This on the left, on the right, I'm sorry, this pin with the M on a Star of David is from a woman who sent me the picture. She comes from a known, she's Catholic, coming from a known crypto-Jewish family, and the last name, Montemayor, you can see it there. The earring on the bottom was given to me by my grandmother inside a shell, which is a very Jewish symbol in Spain. And to the left is Hamsa. And while a Hamsa is used by the Moorish culture and used by the Jewish culture, I don't know where she got it. I don't know how old it is. And it really is not important, because what it is that it was important enough to her to have my mom give it to me on the day of her death, and she knew that I was Jewish. And on the top was from my paternal side. I have found from my mom and dad's side, of the 32 lines going back, all 28 of them, I haven't found the other 4, 28 of them go back to the Inquisitions of Mom and Dad, the Inquisitions of Sevilla, Porto, the Inquisition of Lamego, Coimbra, the Inquisitions of the Canary Islands. When they fled, they went to Cartagena, Colombia. I found the Inquisition documents when they were in Cartagena. And this one in the middle is from my family, from my dad's side. They were Masons. And I know a lot of people have written about the Masons having these crypto-Jewish, and I don't know anything about that, but I can tell you that this is something that came down from the family, and it has the Hamsa, it has the I, and it has our initial of the family in the middle. So all over from mom and dad's side, all of this stuff just kept pouring into me. Next. So here's something very important. So our evidences are in things like this. So here is a very rough drawn town crest that I found. And the name of the village you can see on the left is Fermoselle. And on the right, when you turn it upside down, the letters are in Hebrew. And it says Lisgor in Hebrew, which means closed. This was a town that closed off its history until I got there to revive it. So we are left with things like this. Molly? So just for you to have an idea, so this is my tree before 1600. So I descend going forward, 1600, 1700. So everything that is in olive green are the people, the women that were burned at the stake, and everything that is in purple, they were judged in the Inquisition. And this is my direct maternal line. I read these Inquisition processes at night. This is how I learned what they did, how they ate, what they were doing with their lives, and where they were moving from one place to the other. Next. This is one of those eternally long meetings at the archive in Madrid. I've been in that room, can't imagine how many times. Over here on the right, I'm actually thumbing through an Inquisition record. Everybody's very nice. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, we're so excited you're here. I turn around and I leave, and it's as if I never existed. So I'm still struggling in Spain, and it's been one of my toughest ones. But if I don't get this digitized, I don't have a crowd of people behind me running to do this. So it's going to get done. I mean, I don't know what kind of pressure, you know, Godfather days, but I'm going to have to get this done. Next. So this week, so my work on a global scale, and that's what I love about Kulanu, is that they have a macro and they have a micro viewpoint of the Anusim, or the crypto-Jewish descendants. So you saw the macro, where I go out and I try to get documents. This week, early last week, I got a call from Harriet and Bonita. Would I, you know, could I locate where COVID may have hit these communities hard? And within a couple of days, we managed to get food and incredible amounts of just daily necessities to these Anusim families that were in Nicaragua, in Mexico, in Honduras, and in El Salvador, where one community has 300 families. We made a deal with a food broker there, and they were so amazing that even before they received our money, they packaged up everything. So this is the kind of work that we do with Kulanu, and especially in my regions, that we are just so grateful. Next. These are my books. I have written several. The first one is My 15 Grandmothers, where I talk about my story. They're all in English and Spanish. Then how I found my 15 grandmothers, because everybody wants to follow the same route. Then Fire to Fire. And Fire to Fire is a historical novel with 85% accuracy, because all of those records had all of this cultural information, what they wore, what they did, what was in the last wills and testament. And finally, what I did personally is I followed the money. At some point, it was really hard to follow the names because the names constantly change. But then I thought, you know what, when the IRS is looking for something, they're following the money. So I started following the money to the places where they donated, where they left their last wills and testaments. And I was able to find a lot of different places where the Jews had been hidden. And it's this history that we're trying to get out, because this is our diaspora that we still don't know where all of these people are. And then finally, of course, the recipes of the 15 grandmothers that I spoke to you about. Next. And our sponsors. So I think I am very grateful for the sponsors here today, and we'll hope to have more. And Bonita can talk to you a little bit about that. And Molly, I think we're done with the okay. So that's it. Maybe Bonita wants to say a few words and then we'll open it up to questions, but I will preempt some of the questions. My children is the number one question. So my son lives in Maryland, and he had a child a few years ago, and he did put her at the JCC until 4th grade. I'm sorry, until she was 4, and now she's in a Catholic school. So my children understand their heritage. They come towards the heritage, but and they're pretty much neither here nor there. My daughter just got married a few months ago, and she got married in a secular way, and she's not here and she's not there. Her dad was taking her to church while we were doing Shabbat at home, and it was very difficult. I always laid off. I never pushed anything on my children. This is a very personal decision. They are cognizant of their ancestry, but basically it's up to them where they go with it. And I am very pressured by the rabbi's words that I only have 2 generations, which is why I work with these B'nai Anusim, because if for whatever reason it cannot be the generations from my family, then I want to make sure that I help and extend the hand to the generations of other people's families to come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I mean, you are so wow, and it's really a privilege to have gotten to know you. And the truth is, you have many children around the world. So, you know, that, okay. So a few things. One, we had set this up that if you want Jeannie to sign your recipe book and send it to you, we're offering sponsorships for $50, so the book comes free. And she also has a few other books, which I have the names. Well, she just showed you the names. And she'll send you 3 of her books autographed if you'd like to send $100 to us. And that's the end of my pitch. We have a bunch of questions that came in a little bit before in the registration forms. So one had to do with family names, and Jeannie already told me, if you have questions about family names, you should contact her on her webpage, Genie Milgrom, and she will get back to you with those questions, because those questions take a very long time to answer. We have another question, and I think it's an excellent one. To what do you attribute the emergence of Jewish communities in Latin America at this time?
That's a great question. I was glad I was given that question before, because I had to think about it. It depends on who you ask. There are a lot, it depends how, let's use the word religious or attuned or spiritual you are. A lot of people believe that this is the famous prophecy of the ingathering of the exiles. A lot of people believe that this is about the internet, the ability of the internet. I really don't know. I think that this is the little villagers that are in Armenia, in El Salvador, that you saw the pictures, and they don't know from the internet, right? And they have this fire burning inside of them. So I think that there's a little bit of the prophecy and a little bit of the internet, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Okay, next question. I recently traveled to Cuba, where I visited 3 Jewish communities, an Orthodox, a conservative, and a Sephardic. What is the religious orientation of these new Jewish communities in Latin America?
We pretty much have seen that they self-come together to what they want to be. As Kulanu, we have adopted, for example, a very vibrant Reform community in Guatemala. The community that I told you about that's very poor in Armenia, in El Salvador to the north, there's 300 members. They're all wearing black hats, so pretty much whatever they decide that they're gonna be, and that's pretty much, even though I am observant, what I feel is, you know what, I don't care what they're eating, I don't care what they're doing, just let's bring them back and let's worry about their food later. As far as kashrut, or are they very religious? It's really, my personal mission is, let's get them to understand their heritage and let's bring them back. But as far as what I see, they pretty much just join together for the love of Judaism, and then they kind of mold into a, let's say, usually a conservadox kind of thing, because it's very difficult to follow all of the things down there.
Okay, another question. Another person had a trip to Cuba. I learned that none of the congregations that I visited had a rabbi. Is that the case in these young Latin American communities? How do you attract religious leaders to these developing countries where the congregations most likely are small and dependent on outside aid to survive?
Well, it's interesting. That is part of what we try to do at Kulanu, is that we try to get the visiting rabbis to come down and to teach. I'm working right now with this food distribution with one such rabbi from Mexico City who is visiting these communities, and he is teaching. There's another rabbi that we know well, Rabbi Stephen Leon, who is in El Paso, Texas, and he goes into Mexico. I went with him to Juarez in December. It was dangerous, it was crazy, but there was 80 people that wanted to talk to me. So basically, there are rabbis that are doing these rounds, and Kulanu is associated with 2 or 3 organizations in Israel where we have sent down traveling Beit Dins, and we wait until there are enough people to be able to do the conversions as they want them, conservative, Orthodox, whatever they want. And then in several cases, this organization will send a representative, and they will be teaching locally and going around like in Central America.
Wow. Okay, so here's a question that after you answer, I want to put my 2 cents in. How important are Hayas, UJA, World Jewish Congress, and other Jewish philanthropic organizations to the creation and survival of these nascent communities?
I don't know if we're going to answer the same thing because I've never talked to you about it. However, I see 0. So the answer is 0. It's not happening. I have knocked on the doors. I have had lunch with with these representatives from all of the above organizations, and more so, I'm sure, Harriet and Bonita way before me, and the answer is 0. There is little to no interest. It's just like, you know, it's almost like you don't exist, and it's very, very difficult to grab the attention of anyone, which is why I have spoken at the Knesset, I've spoken at the EU Parliament. I mean, like, how much higher do you want me to go? I spoke at APAC to 25,000 people. The reality is that it's not happening, and now I'll hear Bonita's 2 cents.
You know what? You couldn't have said it better than me. Okay, we have both, Harriet and I have both met over long extended periods of time. I'll never forget, about 3 years ago, the World Jewish Congress personally invited me to come. I dressed up, I parked, I did the whole thing. They were so uninterested. Like, why did you invite me? So exactly. They put the lid on it and say, because the reality, and I think everybody has to understand this, these are Jews all around the world. I mean, we don't only deal with B'nai Anusim, we deal with Africans, we deal in Indonesia, we deal in India, all over the world. We're dealing with communities. For the most part, these groups have not converted. And even by reform standards, in order to become part of the faith, you need some kind of conversion experience. So these are, in their minds, not real Jews or whatever, even if they're living Jewish lives. Some are extremely Orthodox in practice, some are conservative. This is a pitch for our next one. We're having an interview. We have a community in Guatemala of Reform Jews that converted Reform, and the next event, which I think is June 3rd, also at 1 p.m., will be with Rabbi Elise Goldstein, the Reform rabbi who did the conversions there, and Rebecca Orantes, who's a member of that group, and they have become part of the World Reform communities. So, but that, you know,
and I find, like, an hour before this talk, I have this rabbi from believe it or not, Hasidic rabbi from Muncie, who wants me to help him with some of the people that are workers in his community that he feels are B'nai Anusim. I almost fell off my chair. I thought somebody was like kidding me. You know, when you get somebody with a thick Yiddish accent, I kept looking for my husband because I thought he was hiding behind the door with a thick Yiddish accent, making believe he was from Muncie. For me to help people in Muncie, I was blown away. But in general, we see zero.
Right. Okay, I think I don't see any chat
Can
questions.
I talk? Can I talk?
Sure. Only
Okay.
for a minute because we have to move on.
All right.
Okay.
When I first spoke, I put the word Anusim back into the jargon. It didn't exist. And when I first came to the first chief rabbi I spoke to, and I mentioned to him Anusim, he said lost tribes. And I said, no, Anusim. And I explained. And it took a little time until the word became so natural. But Rav Bakshi Doron meant and wanted to immediately create absorption centers and everything for the Anusim. The tragedy is nobody who worked with him just didn't lift a finger.
No, it's
And
hard.
that's where we missed. May he rest in peace.
Thank you.
Jenny,
Bonita, I want to see, there
good
was a question.
luck.
There was a question that I saw, Harriet, that you asked. So at one point, the government of Norway was giving money for the restoration of records because they wanted to be part of the EU commerce, and being part of the EU commerce, they just needed to regain history, whether it was the history of Portugal or Spain. So we were trying to access the money for Portugal, and they gave the money to a Jewish organization within Portugal, and one fellow absconded with the money, and that was the end of the money from Norway. So
Okay.
unfortunately,
That's
we
not
lost
a
that
happy
opportunity.
note to end on.
No, I'll end on a great note. Let me end on the best note. Right before this COVID started, we have the signed contract from Torre do Tombo Archives in Portugal, and we were supposed to begin digitizing in June or July because Portugal did agree for digitization, and to me, they're more ground zero than Spain. And now we may be delayed, but I'm hoping that by the end of the year, we will see this work at least begin in Portugal.
Okay, Gina, you really are an Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. And I want to turn this over to another woman of valor, Harriet Bograf.
So I'm so proud to have Genie as our coordinator for Latin America and a former board member of Kulanu. And we're so proud to have people like Genie and Shulamit, you know, as part of our network. Someone had asked whether we have members. We don't have members. We just have a huge network of friends and allies and partners and volunteers. And we hope you all will want to be part of it as well. Before we say goodbye, I want to take the time to personally thank all of you for your donations to Kulanu over the years, and especially for your extra contributions during this time of economic hardship. Your continued support has meant so much to all of our Kulanu communities. In these challenging times when we can't be sure what turns the economy will take, your support is needed now more than ever. Each community has immediate needs, and some of these needs are of an emergency nature. We thank you in advance for whatever you can do to ease these financial burdens. If you can't give as much as you'd like right now, please consider joining our group of recurring donors who give regularly month after month. And if you can't give at all, or whether you can or not, please pass our information on to friends who may or may not be able to donate, or to your synagogue, or or to someone, you know, who might introduce us to someone who might be able to help in a bigger way. You know, whatever way you can help move this along would be wonderful. We're now going to move on to breakout